Hey everybody, welcome to Fantasy Valley Part 9. In this video I'll be working on a Japanese tea house and a restaurant around it, and in the first half of this video I'll be making the building itself, and in the second half we'll get into path elements and details in the surrounding area. And this is a very slow-paced episode in a sense that it's just sped up 12 times as usual. But I didn't get that much work done, at least I didn't get as much done as I would usually want to do, and this goes for pretty much all of the episodes so far. I have underestimated how much time much of the things that I've been doing take, somehow, and while this isn't really too big of a problem right now, it just means that instead of the 2 episodes that I think I said quite a while ago that it would take before I went into the facades around the lake here, it's gonna take 4 episodes, which is double the amount of time, but not too big of an issue, and if I don't manage to finish it, I'll just be doing it in time lapses and go on to the next area after that. The problem that I have, as you might be able to guess right now, is that I'm not really on a great schedule when comparing like the current date and the amount of time that I still have until the beta comes out, approximately, because nobody has an exact idea, but so far just making this small part of the park has already been taking a lot of time, and because of that I'm gonna change my planning a little bit. We're not gonna head into the Southeast Asian part of the park or the Arabian part of the park after this, but instead I want to focus on the 3 major parts, which are the parts that you can see from the lake and which all have their own kind of weenie. So this area, for instance, has that mountain with the pagoda, but I'm gonna have a big castle with a village in the European section, which is like another central part of the park, and in the American section we'll have some kind of temple sort of thing, which is also going to be very central, and if I have time left I'll get into the areas in the corners, which are the smaller areas and kind of tucked away. But if I don't have time for that anymore, then everything is just going to be those major 3 areas, just because I'm not really sure how much time I really have to finish my stuff. And like I said in the last episode, I do hope to make a lot more stuff than I have been recently, and I can definitely do so. It's not that I'm gonna, get lower quality videos or just completely forget about everything else in my life, but I just think I can do things quite a bit faster than we're doing right now, but we'll see how that's gonna work out. Anyway, the only real effect that has is that I'm right now trying to get the Asian area done, and after that we'll head into Europe and see how that's gonna work out. Anyway, back to what I'm doing right here. This building was kind of tricky and I wanted to throw it off grid a little bit and actually play with these different layers, because there's a typical thing of Asian architecture where the lower floors are wider than the upper floors, and that goes for the roofs as well, and it's something which I haven't really done so far. Like the pagoda, every floor of a pagoda should normally be a bit smaller than the floor underneath it, which I haven't really done so far since, everything within a building is still on the grid, and it's really hard to get those very minuscule kind of differences between the floors, especially since I wanted to make my own roofs here. But here I wanted to experiment with that a little bit and get a second roof on the tea house with a slightly smaller floor and a less broad, wide roof on top of it as well, and that is what I was doing here, which is the reason why the building actually is made out of different buildings, so that I could actually have a 1.5 tile wide part of the roof on top of it without actually going completely off grid or making the building asymmetrical. It does make things a little bit more tricky when it comes to getting things exactly in the middle or decorating the roofs or things like that, but in general I'm quite happy with how it turned out, and it's a bit of forced perspective that I really wanted to try. So that's the very basic shape of the building. It's very simple, it's heavily inspired by many Japanese tea houses. I would say it's also one of the most realistic buildings in a sense that it doesn't do anything ridiculous or mix any different styles. It's a completely Japanese building, but I still wanted to make it somewhat unique, so it's got much more decorations on the roof and on the walls than many of the tea houses that you would find. Like, this is based on a general kind of layout of a tea house, where you have these corner roofs and you have a second floor with another roof on top of it, but almost all of these tea houses just have a very simple, straight to the point kind of roof, very often not even with curving corners, but in this case I really wanted to add a bit of extra detail and personality to the building, so I took the old roofs and changed them up a little bit and put them on top of the building, and I'm quite happy with how that turned out. It's pretty simple in terms of the shape of the building, but it took quite a bit of work to get the kind of shape that I was hoping for and figuring that would work in the entire area. Because this being the garden part of the Asian section as well, I wanted to get a building in here which would kind of fit into the surrounding area without being too dominating over it. I think there's always this thing about Asian architecture where it's completely different from Western architecture because it tries to live in harmony as much with nature as it can, if that doesn't sound too cliche, and Western architecture just usually screws nature over and just builds all on top of it and is a lot less modest in a way. So this building, I wanted to have something that is small enough to fit into the garden kind of area that I have here, so that it would actually fit into the gardens and not feel too out of place in it. But it was also supposed to be quite small because it is sitting right in the middle of this pretty busy area with a lot of water and a lot of paths that I wanted to keep quite open, because it is sitting right in front of the roller coaster and it could block quite a few views if it was too big, so I had to keep it quite small for that as well. And since it is a tea house and since it is just supposed to be sort of like taking part in the garden rather than being like one big attention drawing thing, I also wanted to keep it quite simple and go more for a Japanese style without too many colors, without the paint on the outsides, instead of some sort of very extravagant Chinese style. So this is the way that it turned out, and it's actually my favorite building in the entire park so far. Even though it's really simple, I'm just very happy with sort of like the idea that I had for it, and the way it was going to have to fit into the area is more or less, has more or less worked out exactly the way I wanted it to. But yeah, that's the building. Also, it's pretty funny that it's a tea house, but it's actually a burger restaurant functionality-wise, just because there is no tea kind of stall in the game, and burgers were the next best thing, I guess. Since I didn't have many burgers around here, and we do have the burger gong in pretty close proximity, so if you're into burgers, you can actually go to the Asian area for some reason, which is pretty weird. I'm gonna have to outdo that in the American area somehow probably, but yeah, moving on. We have a couple of tables and chairs, and there are basically 4 kinds of areas where I wanted to put tables and chairs for this small tea house. It's really one of those self-service kind of places where you just get whatever simple kind of fast food you have and sit down somewhere in a nice picturesque area. And as for the picturesque areas, I wanted to make sure to have quite a few of them here, since this is a very important or a good looking point to look at the rest of the park from, which I'll show off in the end of this video. But basically I had to keep some areas around this tea house very open to not only keep the tea house very visible, but also have some nice areas where you could sit down and enjoy some views of the park. And the first kind of viewpoint that I wanted to have is right along that curving path, just because it gives you a great view of the coaster. Another one are some tables underneath the roof of the building, just because that kind of works as well. And the third one, which I'm working on right now, is one that I kind of hope to do a little bit more in the future. It's a bit further away from the rest of the area, and it's not that much in the Asian area anymore really, but it's right next to the lake, which gives you a pretty good view over the lake. And in the future, when we have all of the different areas, when we can actually see the European area and see the American area and the main street of course from the lake, that should hopefully be a pretty good view to be sitting alongside the water as well. It's kind of inspired by like a small seating area next to a lake in the Efteling, where you can see like all of the roller coasters and everything in the park, and it's that kind of feeling and that kind of a more like relaxed part of a theme park where you can sit down and eat some stuff, but where you can also just look at everything that's going on in the theme park, see all the roller coasters and the scenery in the distance, which is what I wanted to do for this small area. And I'm saying small because I really don't have that much space left here. I could have expanded it quite a bit, but the European area is gonna be very close to where I'm building this right now, and I don't want to make it too large. Still save some space for the very big castle which I'm gonna have in the European area, which is absolutely going to loom over the rest of the park. So it is just a very small section of tables and chairs here, but it's probably my favorite part, where I would love to be sitting and just kind of look at these surroundings. Tables and chairs are all just kind of the same. I might switch them up a little bit, and they're kind of simple themselves as well, but I hope to probably switch them up a bit depending on the areas. You could also see me kind of building a parasol kind of thing for a little bit. I decided to give up on that idea just because I couldn't build a very good parasol, but I might still make a couple and put them over some kind of restaurant areas in the future, because they do not only look good and give that kind of restaurant vibe to an area, but it's also just, you know, functional. You don't want to be sitting in the sun or the rain all the time. Now, last but not least, we have a small part where you can sit, which is right in front of the building itself, which I guess is for lazy people, and if you don't want to walk too much to get your food over to a place where you want to eat, I guess this is the place where you want to go. But also, I wanted to keep this part very open, since if I would have already filled this with a building or some foliage, there isn't really any kind of angle from which you can look at the tea house itself from this part of the park. And because of the way that this is now a bit more open and you have these tables and chairs, if you approach this area from the European area, you're going to be able to see the tea house and actually see everything kind of pan out in the distance behind the tea house. And that's kind of the way that I wanted to work out if you walk into this area. And having some foliage around here very quickly would have probably made the tea house too hidden among the forest. So yeah, I wanted to keep that open, but everything was looking very open and boring at this point. So I wanted to close things off a little bit more and make things a bit more interesting. And I figured a good way to do so would be to add some trellis above these tables which I have here, which kind of make this very wide, winding path a bit less wide and intimidating, but it also kind of helps to make this part a bit more interesting, because we have the facades with the buildings on the right side and we have the tea house on the left side here, but in the middle there was just this boring bamboo-like fence, which wasn't really all that good looking or interesting, and kind of like an empty dead gap between the two facades. So I wanted to fill that in with some trellis to make it a bit more interesting. So that's what we're going for here. But I didn't want to end up making it too busy, since it is still a pretty important part to look at the rest of the park from. So it's just that one side where I wanted to add some wood over the tables, and aside from that, they're all pretty much just out in the open. And last but not least in this video, I want to add some path essentials. I don't think I'll be making any new ones, just taking the existing lanterns and benches and planters and putting those around everything. But especially in this area, I didn't really have any of those signs of life yet, any of those barrels or pots and planters that just add a bit of extra detail to the empty areas of the paths or to the empty parts of building fronts. So that's what we're doing here. And yeah, I also wanted to add all sorts of like random stuff around the paths, just to make them a bit less empty and boring. It's something which I always do last though, and sometimes I just even forget about doing it, because it's the very last thing that I do whenever everything else is already finished, just because it's kind of a mindless thing, I think, just adding lots of random details wherever you can. You don't really have to pay too much attention to it, just filling in some of the empty spots. And it generally just does make things look a little bit better, but it, for me at least, can also be a bit distracting if you haven't really finished all of your buildings or path work yet, which is why it's always going to be like one of the very last things that I'm doing. And while I'm doing that round, I also kind of like to look at all of the buildings again and just kind of look at them with a fresh eye, because once you've just built something, you're not like, your judgment of it is usually not as good as when you come back to it a couple of days later and go like, ah, I could change that right there. And that is exactly what I figured for some of these buildings here. A lot of the windows were exactly the same, and I changed a few already off screen, but I was just looking at it and going, well, I could change a couple of things here and there, just because it was looking super repetitive, and a bunch of different kinds of textures and patterns on these windows and doors should make things a bit more interesting. I was also trying to get some planters in on the outside here, but that plan didn't really work out making it myself, so I just got a couple of in-game ones, and that works pretty well. And the rest is just kind of adding a bit of stuff to these buildings. These are some of the most unfinished buildings though. I'm probably gonna do something with them again in the future. Anyway, that's it for the time lapse. I'm gonna give it over to my real-time self here to give you a very quick tour of the park so far. It's been a while since I last did an overview like this, but I really want to do it right now because there's a lot of new detail and smaller things which I want to take some time and zoom into and show off what my entire idea and thoughts behind certain things were, which you can't really show that well on a time lapse, and you definitely can't really take the time to do it. And the first thing that I want to show off right here is the new Japanese tea house, which I am very sorry, Pagoda is probably my favorite building in this entire area. Even though it's so small and not as colorful as the many more abundant buildings in this area are, I just kind of like how laid back and more charming it feels to me. And the reason why I wanted to go for a tea house in this case specifically is, like I said, kind of to get something to fill in this part of the park, make sure that it's not as empty, while at the same time it has that functionality of being a restaurant, which I didn't have yet. And the way it looks right now is basically like this from this side. I wanted to keep this very open. We have a couple of smaller terraces where you can sit down, and the placing of this one here is not as interesting as the other ones, but it does keep this area more open so you can look at the building a bit more. And on the other side we have, of course, the bridge from which you can see the building very clearly, and my favorite angle is definitely from here, where you can really have that feeling of the gardening around it, the bridge in the distance, and see the wooden parts of it next to the water, which I'm really happy with how it turned out. And another terrace that I wanted to add, which is a bit more far away, is next to the water, which hopefully I'm gonna do a bit more in the future as well. I want to make use of the lake as much as I can, and from here you'll be able to see the different areas. So we'll have the very big European kind of castle part here, we'll have probably some kind of American temples in here, and maybe even the African part here is going to be visible. Not too sure about that. And on the other hand, it just makes sure that we have this nice, like, closer to the lake part of the Asian area, bringing it into the rest of the park a bit more. And last but definitely not least, we have the part which is right underneath the trellis here, which is not too big, but like this felt like the most important part of this area to me, because it's the part from which you can see almost everything from the Asian area, and which is kind of like the part where you're going to want to take all your pictures from, in a sense. We have the facades on the side right here with the fancy toilet building and giving you the backdrop of the gates towards the Arabian area. Then we have the coaster on this side interacting with the terrain, and all the way on the other side we have the pagoda and the much bigger stuff behind the gardens, and you can almost see everything in the entire area just from here in like one big panorama. And that's why I wanted to put a bunch of benches and tables and make sure to keep this as open and keep this entire kind of panoramic place as photo takeable as I can, if that makes any sense. And of course, it kind of also works from the other side. We have the view of the tea house from the bridge over here, and you can walk right underneath the coaster, kind of having that big jungle of steel above you. The only thing that I'm slightly worried about is that there's no real protection against the coaster. Realistically, I definitely want to have some coaster nets around here, but there's nothing right here. And while I could, well, quite easily make some kind of simple coaster net underneath this part, the curves over here are very close to the coaster in a Nemesis kind of way, but this path is way more busy than the queue of Nemesis, and I'm not really sure how much I like that. I think I'll just take form over functionality here and just leave it kind of dangerous, just because I like the way it looks, but it's one thing that I would probably say is a flaw of the way that this entire thing is laid out. What else is pretty important is, of course, this view from the lake, which is like the biggest, most important view of the area, and where you can really see it kind of shaping up. And we have the paths over here, where if you go to this part of the park, you're gonna have to walk up to this path here and get pretty much the best view of the hill with the pagoda and the buildings. But if you take like the lower path, we have this big panorama over here where you can like really turn around and see all of the buildings. This is going to be the future station, so that's hopefully going to look fine in the future as well. But you can have all of the buildings in one big wide shot as well. And on the other side, the first thing that I'm going to do in the next episode is get a building around here, as long as there's a wall with a bit of foliage to close this off here. Just to make sure that everything is balanced, that it doesn't look like we just have a big hill here and nothing on this side. And make sure that this is one big cozy plaza that kind of feels like you're in the middle of Asia. And after that, if that's finished and the station is done, then the entire area is pretty much finished and we can move on to what is most likely going to be the next area, and which is going to be the European part with the castle. So thank you guys for watching this episode. I hope to see you guys next time, in which I'll start working on the building here and maybe even the station. Bye bye.